the usual stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if we're online.
Yeah, I just got a notification on YouTube.
Okay, good. So let me see here. How's your Christmas Eve going?
Pretty well. Pretty well. Um, yeah, just went and got some food. That's about it.
Does your kids open presents today or tomorrow?
They opened one present this morning.
Okay. Yeah, we cheat and our kids have opened all their presents already.
Have they?
Yeah. So they can spend the rest of today and tomorrow playing with their presents. And then tomorrow we'll do stuff like look at Christmas lights around the neighborhood. What else? Making gingerbread cookies and that sort of thing.
Right. Cool.
Okay, so I want to find something that I found today on 5 main reasons why some say that Jesus didn't even exist. And you tell me if you agree with them. Okay, so the number one reason is, oh yeah, this is the one I always bring up, that no first century scholar evidence whatsoever points to the actual existence. So there's no evidence, contemporary evidence for Jesus whatsoever. And
Some will claim that that Paul was a scholar, and Paul references Jesus.
Yeah, but again, if we look at writings from 0 to 33, like during the life of Christ, there's nothing, right?
That's right.
So everything is post that. I remember when I was in Sunday school asking the class, why do you think Jesus never wrote anything? Have you ever asked that question?
Yeah, and there are many people who could write at that time. I mean, of course, it was far, far less than what there are now, but for such a important figure in history, it does seem rather surprising him not to. The one thing that I don't like about, or the one thing to be aware of, is that when it comes to scholars of the time referencing Jesus, the question that you need to ask depends on what type of Jesus you're talking about.
Yeah.
So Christians, for the most part, believe in the biblical Jesus, who is a very grandiose figure who, did miracles, and his word of his fame spread far and wide, and his life was accompanied by events that were very apparent and very clear to the people surrounding him, and very obviously important and obviously influential. But that's for the most part not the Jesus that historians talk about. And so when it's pointed out that no scholars, no contemporary scholars reference Jesus, that is not very expected on the biblical Jesus, but it's pretty expected if Jesus was really just a small figure who didn't really do much and wasn't very well known.
Yeah, it's the Jesus as described by the Gospels, by far the vast majority of historians say does not exist. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think most, or at least the secular historians and even critical historians who are Christians would probably agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one thing that always bothers me about William Lane Craig when he comes out and says the vast majority of historians say that, number one, Jesus existed, he died on a cross, went into a tomb, rose again, and then ascended to heaven. Like, no, the majority of historians do not say that. Only basically fundamental Christian historians say that.
Yeah, so there have been a lot of secular historians that have been convinced by the idea that there was an empty tomb, because they see that as like a necessary component to explain why followers would claim that he was resurrected. But, you know, there are pretty prominent historians who have been convinced out of that position despite holding it, like, for example, Bart Ehrman. But, yeah, it does bother me when he says those sorts of things too, because I don't think it's really representative of historians, or at least biblical scholars. It's definitely not representative of historians, because historians, by and large, don't really pay any attention to those kind of claims because they think it's just the same in the same class of claims as Romulus or, you know, any other historical figure that there's very scanty evidence for.
I'm going to bring up, where is it? Some names of historians living at the time that, so these are a list of historians that lived, let's say, between 0 and 100 AD that were silent about the historical Jesus. Now, do you want to explain, like, I'm going to use 0 to 100 AD or 0 to 33 AD. Are you aware of when those time designations even came into being?
It was quite a bit later, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't until, like, maybe, was it even past, like, the first millennium?
No, it wasn't past the first millennium. I think it was around 500 AD.
500, okay.
So at 500 AD, someone said, I'm writing this in 500. And just arbitrarily said, okay, we're going to mark 500 years prior to when I'm writing this as 0. And I think someone can fact check me on that in the chat, but I think that is correct.
Yeah, I honestly don't trust my memory on that.
Oh, this is pretty fuzzy, isn't it? But here's a list of, I don't know, 20 or so historians who, most of these are Jews and Greeks, who lived during Jesus' time when Jesus lived. These historians were alive when Jesus was alive, and they wrote nothing about Jesus. So when, I don't know, there was a huge earthquake when Jesus died. The temple was torn in two when Jesus died. People came out of the graves when Jesus died. When Jesus was born, when Jesus was born, Herod apparently had all the newborn Jewish sons killed, or no, all the Jewish boys killed, right? Yeah, is it just Jews, or all the boys?
I don't actually remember. Is that in Luke's account of?
Yeah, I think so. So what other major events happened? The zombies coming out of the graves.
The worldwide darkness. Did you mention that?
No, I haven't mentioned that. No. So here's some pretty major historical events that any one of these 20 or so historians could have wrote about, and they did not. Why? If they really happened.
Yeah. And I think that that's a great question for somebody who believes the accounts told in the Gospels. It's not a very, like I was saying before, I don't really think it's that convincing when it comes to historians debating whether or not he existed as a historical figure, because none of them are really proposing that those events happened. But I'm getting a bit of an echo. It might be from me. But...
Let me turn it down a bit. Okay, so...
But it's a great point. Like, if you believe in the biblical Jesus, you have something to explain. You have something to give account for. You need to... maybe a plausible explanation as to why there are so many people of the time who could have written about those events but didn't. Maybe what you would appeal to is that that they did actually write about it, but for some reason it wasn't preserved. This definitely happened. There are lots of things that were written around the time for which we have no record of, because, and we know that they were written because we say, for example, have the titles of the books, but we don't actually have the contents. The difficulty with that excuse is we do actually have good reason to think that Christians of those time periods would have referenced those in works that do survive that were written by Christians. And yeah, but anyway.
So yeah, the number one point is there's at least 20 historians that we know of that wrote during Jesus's life, and yet they wrote nothing about Jesus or any of the major events that happened during that time that the Gospels say happened. That should be a huge question mark, and I think this is something that a lot of Christians don't really think about, don't even... like I was talking to a guy the other day, I think he was totally oblivious to the fact that there was zero evidence of Jesus that was written during his lifetime. And if Jesus existed, why didn't he write anything? And second point is that the very earliest writings we have about Jesus, it's not from the Gospels, it's from Paul. And so Paul, if we were to get into a time machine, let's assume, I'm not even convinced the Apostle Paul exists. Do you think he existed?
I haven't. I think in the last conversation that we had about this stuff, I mentioned that I wasn't that familiar with the arguments against his existence, or why people even propose that, given that we have letters written by somebody who claims to be Paul. But I'm not 100% certain. I do believe that Paul was a historical figure and that he wrote a number of epistles, a number of letters to churches that we still have. I mean, it's worth pointing out that we also have letters that we know weren't written by Paul, yet claim to be. There's a pretty solid consensus among historians about that fact.
Now, some people say, I forget the guy's name, but there is one hypothesis that the Apostle Paul never existed, but really it was it Tiberius? There was some... I think
Simon Magus or something.
There was some Greek guy who was from Tarsus, was a persecutor like Paul was, and that Paul's earliest letters were basically written by him.
So do you think, here's a question, given the contents of the letters, I mean, it is a little bit unusual that they claim to be by Paul, but you're saying that they're not. Do you think it matters a lot if they weren't? Because the thing is that Paul is not very connected to Jesus in the first place. He, well, at least the historical Jesus that people claim exists, like, he didn't know him in flesh and blood. I mean, it's claimed in his letters that Jesus revealed himself to Paul, but it's not like he was a disciple of Jesus, and he even in fact never claims that he knew people who were disciples that like sat at the feet of Jesus or anything like that. He does claim to have met Peter and James, but he never says of them that they were disciples. He says that they were apostles. But yeah, do you think that Paul existed?
I don't know. If he did exist, it's clear to me based on the earlier writings. So Colossians, Galatians, First and Second Thessalonians, First and Second Corinthians. What else?
So I don't think Colossians. I think Colossians is a forgery, isn't it?
Oh yeah, you're right. Galatians, I meant.
Yeah. So First, Second Corinthians.
So there's 7 books. There's 7 books that were written before the Gospels, and if you read them chronologically, you'll notice something very interesting, and that is Paul has no idea who Jesus' parents were. He probably wouldn't know who Mary and Joseph were. He knows nothing of the specific miracles that Jesus did on his ministry. The only thing Paul knows about Jesus is that he had some type of death and resurrection.
So just to push back on that a little bit, I would phrase that differently, because I don't know if we can claim that he had no knowledge of things that he fails to mention.
Right, that's true.
The important thing to point out is that he doesn't, whether by having no motivation or whether by not knowing, he doesn't mention any details about specific miracles Jesus performed on earth, or any kind of like names of his parents or his genealogy, or really even that he was a teacher on earth. I think you're right about that.
But then the question has to be asked, why? Why doesn't he mention these things? Why is it the first letters that historians say are not forged? Why the silence about the historical Jesus?
Yeah, so the things that I hear claimed are that he effectively had no occasion to do so, that what he was trying to convey to the churches he was sending letters to were more details about church teaching, how to act as members of the church, how to pastor, and that for whatever reason there weren't any details about Jesus's life that he thought relevant to mention. But so they try to make the claim that the content and the context of the letters doesn't demand mention of the kind of facts that we're thinking of, because they say that Paul, in writing to these churches, was not writing a biography of a man that he knew of, but instead were writing about particular issues that concern those churches at the time. Now, well, maybe you want to give some comments as to why you think that's not a very reasonable claim.
Well, no, one thing I've heard is that they were getting older. If the story is true, they're aging, they're about to die, and they realize, oh, Jesus said he'd come back in our generation, but he hasn't. Oops, we better start writing some of this stuff down about who Jesus was and what he did when he lived. And so that's why the Gospels wrote more of the historical account. When Paul was writing, I think the thought was Jesus is going to return in our lifetime. So he didn't bother writing about the historical Jesus. That's what I've heard from some Christians.
Yeah, and so that's a reason why he wasn't writing a biography.
Right.
But it doesn't explain why there were no facts about Jesus that Paul knew that were relevant in the arguments that he made. Because Paul, he hits on many different issues, like things regarding morality, things regarding money, things regarding marriage, things regarding behavior within the church, things regarding gifts of the Spirit and how the Holy Spirit works. And why is it that when discussing these topics, some of which Jesus actually, at least according to the Gospels, directly spoke about. Why, in his argument to these people, didn't that come up? Why didn't he talk about what Jesus said as opposed to giving his own argument?
What I have up on the screen right now is Philo. I forget which Philo this is. There's a bunch of Philos.
Philo of Alexandria.
Yeah.
I think.
He lived, I think, 30 BC roughly to 60 AD. No, maybe not that late. But anyhow, he wrote at least decades before Colossians, the logos of the living God is the bond of everything, holding all things together. Now imagine 30, 40, 50 years later, Colossians, you read, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. It seems like it's a lifting, a borrowing of Philo's writings.
Yeah, and there are other passages, because as I pointed out before, I don't actually think Colossians is an authentic letter of Paul, but there are other passages in Paul which I think show a belief in a pre-existent divine being named Jesus, who like has particular titles given to him, like firstborn and stuff like that, and that parallel very strongly with Philo's works. So it seems that either like there was a common influence on Philo and Paul, or Philo was an influence on Paul. I mean, I'm not too sure which. I would suggest that it was probably the former, because I think what Philo writes, I think it's reasonable to believe that some of that philosophy existed outside of Philo, like that Philo wasn't the sole originator of that.
Yeah, and Richard Carrier, basically, his theory is that if you look at the first letters of Paul, the ones that most historians say are not forgeries, there's only a couple passages where you could say that Paul is actually talking about a physical, real person, and even that's contested. It's more like Jesus is viewed as this spiritual being who died in a was it third heaven, second heaven, that there's actual places, not on earth, but in between the earth and the top heaven. There's different heavens, and Jesus was in one of those heavens, and that's where he died and rose again, not here on earth. And there might be some Christians listening to that and say, what in the world are you talking about, Doug? But if you study the culture and the history of that day, what I just said wasn't bizarre at all. That's was common knowledge, that there was different environments, different states of being. There was
like concentric heavens above, in which there were believed to be copies of things that we see in this world. For example, many Jews believed in like a celestial temple that existed in the heavens. It's quite a foreign concept for us now to believe of like solid things and physical things existing in these different layers, but back then it was actually quite a reasonable belief. There is some evidence even that some people believe Adam was buried in heaven, and to be buried in heaven sounds a bit strange to our notion, but apparently people believed those kinds of things back then.
Yeah, the first heaven is basically the Earth's atmosphere. The second heaven is outer space. Deuteronomy 17:3, Jeremiah 8:2, Matthew 24:29. The third heaven is where God and the holy angels reside. Deuteronomy 10:14, 1 Kings 8:27, Psalm 115. So we have three heavens. And Paul was caught up in which one? Remember that? Is it in 2 Corinthians 12? I think Paul says, no, that's not a forgery.
Although we don't quite know whether or not it was Paul, because he doesn't actually refer to himself. He says like somebody I know, or I can't remember exactly his phrasing. And like, some scholars like think that it's a story about himself, but for whatever reason he's not referencing himself as the one experiencing it. But
Yeah, he says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in body I do not know, or out of the body God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. And I know such a man, whether blah, 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 into paradise, inexpressible words, which a man is not permitted to speak. So this is some say this is Paul having a vision of being up into the third heaven, which would be where the God and the angels are, according to that other thing I read. So, yeah, if this Paul was a real guy who actually wrote this, he had some weird and bizarre visions.
And what does it tell you that these people believed these kinds of things? Like, one thing I'm interested in is when you learn that people of this time, I mean, not entirely, like not all people, of course, but, many people of this time had this worldview, which we know now to be probably false, and they came to believe it, and they passed on experiences which we have reason to doubt. What does that tell us about them as thinkers? What does it tell us about them and their epistemology, the way they went about finding out what was true? My difficulty in believing the claims of early Christians is that I see evidence that makes me doubt they were very reliable reasoners. It makes me doubt they had good reasons for their belief, despite it being true that they believed it. Even today, we see many people who believe things that we don't think they have good reason for. Like, Christians watching in this stream will agree that there are many people of different religions out there who don't have good reasons for believing what they do, because what they believe is false. And I wonder, I would like to get a better picture of how superstitious these people were, how readily they believed the claims of their fellow man, and how often they questioned.
Yeah, well, imagine someone coming up to you and saying, hey, Doug, Cam, I had this amazing vision the other night, and I think it was from God. No, I know it was from God. It was X, Y, and Z. And I'm going to write this down because I think these are God's words. Now, most Christians today would hear something like that and say, no, I highly doubt that. But this is...
Some Christians didn't believe it.
Yeah, some Christians would believe it. Some Pentecostals, I bet. But this is exactly what happened to Paul. So why is it that you take a very similar type experience and backdate it 2,000 years and put it in a book? It now is God's word. But today, no way is that, most people would say that's not a reliable method. Someone just telling you they had this experience, this vision, whatever, a dream, even a hallucination. No, you can't, let's be serious. It could be from God, but we know people have visions and experiences and hallucinations all the time, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's from God. In fact, it could be from Satan if you believe in the devil. Why is it that people just automatically assume that what happened to Paul was from God?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I wonder if the fact that it's in a book that people have revered for such a long time has an influence, and the fact that it's really old, and so many people have been convinced by it. It makes people ask the question, oh, well, how have we all been so duped? Why is it that everybody believed it? Now, I don't think that those are good reasons, but I wonder if that's part of it. I know when I became a Christian, I approached the Bible with a kind of reverence that I no longer hold for it. I saw it as having authority because of its place as an ancient text. But the reality is that I now have other books on my bookshelf which contain ancient writings, and I don't approach those with that kind of reverence. And the claims made within them, I treat with the same kind of skepticism I treat with the person down the road who claims they had an experience of a divine being.
And I think this is exactly why Christianity is dying. Yes, dying in the United States, especially because of things like the internet, access to information very quickly. People, like when I was a kid, it was almost a default position that the Bible was held up and revered. That default position is eroding quickly. That people just say, oh, okay, this is the Bible, but so what? That doesn't mean that everything in it's true. People are starting to think like that. And that never used to be the case, at least when I was young. Like, we would never question it. No, this is just God's word. So anyhow, I just want to review. First reason why some people say that Jesus never existed. And again, what we're talking about is the Jesus as described in the Gospels. Because there's 20 or so historians of that time who wrote nothing about Jesus, extra biblical historians. There's silence. There's nothing. We have zero evidence, neither physical or in written text form, of any mention of Jesus at all from during his lifetime or even shortly thereafter. And then number two, the second reason why some people think Jesus never existed is that the very first mention of Jesus is from Paul. This first 7 books that he wrote predate the Gospels, and even Paul doesn't really mention a physical Jesus. He mentions a more of a spiritual type Jesus. He does mention Jesus knew the brother James, and does refer to the 12. Does he refer to the 12 in the first 7 letters? Or is that later?
I think he says the apostles. I don't know if he says the 12. He might have.
Yeah.
Oh no, well, he does in 1 Corinthians 15 mention the apostles.
Yeah.
But although the brother of James part, you said that Jesus mentioned that. But
No, I mean Paul. Yeah.
yeah, Paul mentioned meeting James, the brother of the Lord, when he also met with Peter. And there's debate among historians whether or not that's a reference to a brother who is, an actual biological brother of a living historical figure. I think that there's pretty compelling arguments to not see it as evidence for that, but, there's a lot of disagreement there anyway.
So those are the 2 main reasons so far that I have. The third reason is that the New Testament stories don't even claim to be first-hand accounts. So you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they're written in the third person. Nowhere will you read, I saw this happen. So it's not a first-person account. They're anonymous, except for John. John's not anonymous, is it?
No, I think it's anonymous.
It is? Okay.
I mean, it refers to towards the end of it doesn't come out at the beginning of John and say, I'm John writing blah, blah, blah. But towards the end, I think like in chapter 21 or 23, it has like a kind of an indication that the person writing it is the person experiencing something in the text, like maybe the beloved disciple. I can't actually remember, but most historians that I've read don't think that John is a eyewitness account.
Yeah, so, and it is so weird, and I don't know how this happens, because I was in my probably early 30s until I finally figured this out, that the Gospels are anonymous, we really don't know who wrote them, and they're written in the third person. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, think about the nativity scene. It's Christmas. Think about the birth of Jesus, talked about in Luke and Matthew. Mark and John don't even mention it. Whoever wrote that, if they were actually Luke and Matthew, they wouldn't have been there at the nativity scene. They weren't even talked about even knowing Jesus until Jesus was an adult. So it's clear.
Well, and Luke didn't even know Jesus either.
Yeah, Luke and
Or at
Matthew.
least, according to the tradition of who Luke was.
They wouldn't have known Mary and Joseph. So in other words, the bottom line is they still wrote about it without seeing it. So if they can write about the birth of Jesus without seeing it, why couldn't they have wrote all the gospel narrative without seeing it?
Well, and they contradict each other in the birth accounts as well.
I'd be careful using I've refrained using the word contradictory. To me,
okay, they give different stories. You could try to provide a kind of harmonization, as to fit them together, but they definitely account different stories, different elements. And I mean, I would go so far as saying that they do contradict, at least on the date of Jesus's birth. I don't think that they give a consistent account of when Jesus was born. But
well, let's talk about that. In Matthew, it says that Jesus was born at the time of Herod. Or is that Luke?
Yeah,
I think it's Matthew.
I think it is Matthew. And because Luke's the one who talks about it with the census under Quirinius.
So people say King Herod died between -3 and -1, and or -4 and -1. And then Luke talks about this census, and there's no census talked about in history until 5 or 6 AD. So now we have a problem. Is it Governor Quirinius?
Quirinius, I think. Oh, no. I might be saying that wrong.
Yeah. So we have a problem here. The problem is that either Jesus Quirinius. The problem is either Jesus was born around -3 to -1, or he was born 4 to 6. In there somewhere. It's a big gap. Now, the way Christians get around that is saying, well, there could have been a census taken in -1 to -3 without it being recorded. I mean, you would think a census by definition is a recording, but we don't have record of it. That's basically the only out they have. They can't say that King Herod lived to 5 AD. That just won't fly. We have too much evidence to say that he died sooner than that.
And I don't even really think it's an out, because at least on probabilistic grounds, we have very little, we have really no reason to think that a census would demand traveling to a place of origin.
Yeah. Now, why? The theory is that the census was totally fabricated. But there's a reason why it was fabricated. And it was to fit the prophecies together, to force them to come together, because incorrectly I'll add that the writer of Luke thought, the Old Testament prophesies a Nazarene. So the Messiah will come from the clan of the Nazarenes. But mistakenly thought that means he had to come from Nazareth. And so they had to sort of put Jesus coming from Nazareth, but there's another prophecy that says that it would be in the line of King David, born in Bethlehem. So how do we get a Nazarene, which really is in the Old Testament is talking about a family tribe and not a place? How do we get this person from Nazareth to Bethlehem? Oh, I know. Let's make a census that people who live in who've moved away have to come back to their homeland and be registered, which there's no record in history of that ever happening. And so that's how Luke kind of took two prophecies and melded it into one by fabricating the census idea. I say fabricating. It could have happened, I will admit, but it seems doubtful. It's the more plausible explanation.
We don't have good reason to believe it.
We don't have a good reason to believe that any of this actually happened. And it is a plausible explanation that the writer of Luke was trying to fit two prophecies together. And keep in mind, Mark, the first gospel written, mentions none of this. It's just silence from him.
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned, like, you put strong emphasis on the fact that the synoptic gospels at least were anonymous, and that we didn't have a good reason to think that they were written by eyewitnesses due to the way that they narrate the story. I would say the most prominent reason why we shouldn't think of them as like eyewitnesses accounts is the fact that Mark is clearly the first written, and Matthew and Luke very clearly adapt Mark's gospel for their own purposes in many places, but in many places also copying practically verbatim, sometimes literally verbatim. And yeah, I think that is a marker of somebody who wasn't an eyewitness. I mean, it would be a very strange thing if I experienced something that you also experience, and I cribbed from your account and made modifications that contradicted yours, or at least appear to contradict yours, and didn't write my own memory of the events from a first-person perspective.
Yeah, whenever I hear Christians say that, well, of course, Doug, there's similarities and even some word-for-word things from Mark, Matthew to Luke to even John, because it's God's word. It's the consistency shows that this is God working through many different people to tell a consistent story. But then when you talk about the inconsistencies, how Luke's nativity scene is different than Matthew's, well, that just shows that, it's different perspectives, but it's still showing that this is God's word, because we would be suspicious if it was exactly the same. You notice the problem here: no matter what you say, what consistency proves it's God's word, and inconsistency proves it's God's word. They're just basically believing this is God's word no matter what.
Yeah, it comes back to that old saying that you can't have it both ways.
But I wanted to say one thing about the contradiction. So if you're an atheist listening to this, and if you notice all the sort of differences in the birth story and the resurrection story, and they're there, like, was it one woman who went to the tomb, 2, 3, 4 or more? Was it one angel at the tomb, one man, 2 men, 2 angels? Who went to... when was Jesus
on the cross?
What was said on the cross? Father, into your hands I commit my spirit, or why have you forsaken me? Like, there's 3 or 4 last words of Jesus. All these problems, they're technically not contradictions. So I would recommend don't call them contradictions. But what I would highlight to a believer is that they have to resort to the maximum hypothesis on each explanation. So when it says, when they're asked the question, well, how many women went to the tomb when Jesus rose from the dead? You always have to go with the big number. Because if you say 1, well, they say, the other Gospels just didn't mention the other 3. So you always have to use the biggest kind of compilation of each individual story. So if you were to try to take Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and make one Gospel, that one Gospel would have all the biggest numbers in it. It would have to.
Yeah, and it will also have very, very interesting things like Jesus actually clearing the temple twice instead of just once, despite the fact that the synoptics don't mention it happening twice, and and one at the beginning of the ministry and one at the end, and all of these types of things. So it's like this mega gospel that kind of tells events in this way that makes every detail included and harmonized, despite no individual account actually attesting to it. So it's always the mega gospel that you create is not really corroborated by any one gospel. it's quite strange. But then there are things that I considered like genuine contradictions, like that effectively there's not really much meaning to the word contradiction if these don't count. And of course, excuses will always be given, but the difficulty is that, like, when you have 10 unlikely and strained excuses for a text, you've got to be asking yourself, is it very likely that all of these excuses are true? Wouldn't it be more likely that, like, at least one of these excuses is false? Or maybe more of them. Maybe it's just the case that the individual gospel authors were trying to emphasize different things that were relevant to their church at the time, or they disagreed with previous gospel authors of what facts were relevant in Jesus, what facts were true.
I'll just throw this up as an aside. Justin Martyr, he was one of the first Christian apologists ever. And he said in somewhere in the early 2nd century, when we say that he, Jesus Christ, our teacher, was produced without sexual union, was crucified and died and rose again and ascended to heaven, we propound nothing different from what you believe regarding the sons of Jupiter. Whether he really said that, I don't know, but...
Yeah, it's an interesting quote. Sorry, I'm just grabbing a jersey. Be back in a moment.
Okay. So when it comes to contradictions, my advice when you're talking to a believer is don't go for the little stuff, because they have solutions to every little contradiction you can think of. You just look online and you can find Christians explaining away all these so-called contradictions. The big stuff, which I think is the stuff that matters, is the contradictions of salvation. Works versus grace, sovereignty versus free will, God being perfectly just and perfectly merciful, God being omnibenevolent and omniscient and omnipotent at the same time. That is the major contradiction right there. Those three omnis, how can you have a creature that's omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent at the same time? And it's basically, Sam Harris's, well, he probably didn't say it first, but if there's someone suffering, God either doesn't care to help or cannot help or will not help. You can't be omnibenevolent and let a child die of cancer.
So I personally believe that those attributes aren't so much contradictory as they are predictive of a different world, one that we don't live in. So maybe they are contradictory, like maybe they are incompatible or logically inconsistent, but for me, they just contradict experience.
Well, yeah, are you talking about the difference between experiential contradictions and logical contradictions?
Yeah, well, so some people claim that, like, the attributes of God are logically inconsistent. And that may well be true, but when it comes to, like, omnibenevolence and omnipotence, I think the issue is more to do with the world that we discover ourselves to be in. Doesn't match what is predicted by a being that has those properties.
Okay, so the reason why people think that Jesus, as described in the Gospels, never existed is because, number one, there's zero evidence of Jesus existing while he exists. We have nothing written down about Jesus while he was alive. Number two, the very first pieces of texts that we do have about Jesus don't go into his biography, don't talk about Jesus being the person who does miracles, has a family, has friends. It's all pretty silent about that sorts of things. and those are Paul's first 7 letters, and then comes the Gospels later. Number 3, the Gospels are not first-hand accounts. They're anonymous, written in the third person. We don't know who wrote them. Number 4, that there are inconsistencies even among the Gospels on so many things. And of course, Christians have solutions to each and every one. But at some point, I would think they get tired of always having to come up with a solution. And some of these solutions are, like, there's one about which looks so much like a contradiction, where Jesus says, take a walking stick or don't take a walking stick. I forget exactly where it's found. And I looked up the Christian solution to this problem, and it was it must have been over 500 words, a full page of text trying to explain why that's not a contradiction. And then the last reason I have here is that modern scholars who claim to have uncovered the real historical Jesus depict widely different people. Like, who is Jesus? Even if he was a historical person, who was he? And even historians do not agree what this physical Jesus, who he is. For example, David Fitzgerald, he says, Jesus appears to be an effect, not a cause. Paul and the rest of the first generation Christians searched the Septuagint translation of Hebrew scriptures to create a mystery faith for Jews, complete with pagan rituals like the Lord's Supper, Gnostic terms in his letters, a personal savior God to rival those in their neighbors in Egypt, Persia, Rome. So he says that, is Jesus sort of like the Jewish rabbi, or is he a great teacher, or is he this meek and mild and gentle pacifist, almost political guy who's trying to change the government? It seems like historians really don't, they differ on what this Jesus' purpose was, what he actually did. I think there's only 2 things that they agree on, and that is that he was baptized by John, and the only reason why they agree on these 2 things is because it's they have 2 different sources, and they view John and the Synoptic Gospels as one source. So the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's they put in a different category. And so they say between John and the other 3 Gospels, the only thing they agree on is that Jesus was baptized by John and that he was known as the King of the Jews and was crucified. And that's it.
And even then, one of the arguments that they give for believing that he was baptized by John is an argument from embarrassment, which is, I think, logically fallacious. They argue that, like, the gospel authors wouldn't recount a detail that would be embarrassing to them, and that John baptizing Jesus would embarrass them. But I happen to believe that Mark, or at least the author of Mark, wasn't embarrassed by that fact. But yeah.
So should we try to come up with a theory, an encapsulating theory, that can explain who this Jesus person was, if he existed at all? I'm going to give it a shot here. This is my opinion, and I could be totally wrong. But I think there was trouble between the Jews, the Greeks, the Jews and the Romans. And the Romans basically in the mid-first century said, how are we going to deal with all these Jews? And around just before the destruction of the temple, maybe even after, they came up with this idea. Why don't we kind of come up with a new religion, a more pacifistic one, to calm these people down? And we will use the Old Testament as our sort of first, if you have a movie with the sequels, it's, the original movie, and this new religion is going to be the sequel to it. So a lot of what we can use, we can get out of the Old Testament. We can even use some of Greek literature, like the Odyssey, Homer's works, and some other Greek mythology. And let's make a screenplay. Let's make a passion play. And there was many passion plays of the time. And maybe, and this is where I'm unclear about, but they could have based it on a real charismatic figure guy who came out of the Essene movement, an apocalyptic movement. And so they wrote this screenplay, loosely based on a real guy. And this is why you see almost a contortion of prophecies being fulfilled in the New Testament, because they basically were scourging through the Old Testament looking for prophecies to fulfill. And not one of them is perfect. And I think this is how they came up with the gospel story. Now, Paul throws a wrench into this, a big wrench. And so maybe they, instead of using this loosely real character out of the Essene movement, maybe they used Paul. And again, I'm assuming Paul even existed. And to create their narrative. One thing that always struck me was, you know, the verse that says in the Gospels when the Pharisees asked Jesus about whether or not they should pay taxes? And Jesus says, render unto Caesar which is his. That's something a Roman would write in the government and high up, right? And so now they're telling these poor people, give money to us. So if they actually wrote this, I thought that was kind of a little red flag of, and then the other little red flags would be stuff like James and John being referred to as the sons of Zebedee, straight out of Greek mythology. And then the terrible prophecies being fulfilled, like the prophecy out of Zechariah 9:9, where I think Luke and Matthew differ on whether it was one donkey or two colts walking into Jerusalem. They both, the writers kind of viewed the prophecy differently. They translated it differently. And so
Matthew is the one that has two.
Yeah. So it's almost like, okay, so they're writing this book, these books, and these Greek scholars probably wrote these, the New Testament or the Gospels, and they had little differences in how they viewed the Old Testament Greek prophecies, and so and you can see that in the New Testament, these small differences. Say another one was that Jesus would be born of a virgin. They got that from the Greek translation of the Hebrew, which translated into virgin, but really the Hebrew Old Testament says just a young woman, but they made it into a virgin, which is more like the Greek mythology. Noisy Splatter says Christianity was an inside job.
So I don't really believe any of that.
You don't?
No.
So what's your theory?
I think more along the lines of how Carrier thinks. Although I'm not totally sure that Jesus didn't exist in the first place. I would probably say that I'm more agnostic. Like, I'm more in like the kind of like 30% probability, 40% probability, that kind of category. Like, I have doubts, and I think I have good reason to doubt, but I'm not sure. So I think Paul, that wrench that you spoke of, I think is too big of a wrench. I think he, given the fact that he is the earliest writing about Paul, I think that, and the fact that we have like a very early high divine view of Jesus, like, I think that he and those he was in communication with are more the origin of the belief. I think that Jesus as a divine figure more came out of Jewish belief, syncretistic Jewish belief. Well, one thing that's worth mentioning here is that people often make the claim that Jewish belief was very consistent and unified, but the reality is that we have evidence that there was, quite diverse Jewish beliefs, especially because of the fact that Jews had been exiled into different regions where they were influenced by different religions, but I think that my belief is that Paul's Christ is pretty much like the earliest version of Jesus, and he is like a divine being who provides salvation through his death and resurrection.
But couldn't have the...
And that the gospel authors later effectively like historicized what was a celestial being.
Yeah, and that kind of goes with what I was saying, like,
but I don't think that it was perpetrated by the Romans. I think that there's I think the evidence for that is pretty slim. I think more the believers, or like at least the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, I think come out of Christian communities. But I do think that Mark is effectively, what would I call it? Like it's a giant allegory, like a giant parable. I don't think that Mark, or like the author of Mark, really believed that he was writing historical events. But I don't think that he was like commanded to by like some kind of Roman conspiracy or like, that he was doing it for the purpose of creating like a more pacified religion to stop the conflict between Jews and Romans. Because I think that like that belief in a more passive religion exists in the writings of Paul prior to the Gospels. And I actually think that Mark as a text actually reflects Paul's early belief, albeit in an allegorical historical fiction way, more than what the later Gospels do. But anyway, you make comments now.
Well, but at some point the Romans had to put their seal of approval to propagate the belief. Correct?
I think that happened much later, though. I think that we have evidence of churches existing in different regions of the Roman Empire from a pretty early stage, and at least through Paul. And I don't think that in the empire, I don't think that there was any need for new ideas to be like officially propagated and blessed by like Roman authorities. Like there was quite pluralistic beliefs in the time. There were many different faiths and mystery religions and that people followed, including the Jewish beliefs. And primarily what the Romans were interested in is that you gave like allegiance to the Roman gods. Jews didn't have to do that because they had like some kind of special relationship with the Roman Empire. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that it needs to be a conspiracy by people deliberately acting to create a religion to resolve conflicts. I think that was more a natural, organic manifestation of the fact that Jews had been in conflict with Romans for many years leading up to the first century, and efforts to overthrow Roman rule through force were unsuccessful. And I think that naturally created an environment where it was very easy for people to conceive of ways in which Jews could become saved and Jews in their situation become no longer oppressive, simply by claiming that God had effectively, like saved them, regardless of the fact that the
But how
Romans
do
were
you?
still ruling.
But it seems clear to me that whoever wrote the Gospels, very scholarly people, high level Greek.
Yeah, I definitely think that they had a very clear and obvious Greek education. Like, it's clear, or at least in the case of Mark, it's clear that he had read works like Homer, and that he had a very strong command of written Greek, and same goes for Matthew and Luke. But the idea that only those in like an elite position being instructed by like some kind of Roman authorities had that education is just false. Like, we know that like there was a lot of illiteracy in the time, and it was more rare to be that educated. But like, there's no doubt that people who weren't in league with the government.
But okay, here's my question: how many Jews at that time, literate Jews, were literate in Greek
Many.
but at the same time would write about a Messiah who it's clear to Jews that Jesus was not the Messiah, the majority of them, the educated
Well,
ones.
I think many, because like, as you see from the Septuagint, which was written in what, like 177 BC or something like that, oh no, actually maybe it wasn't that quite that early, but the Septuagint, which is a translation of the Hebrew Bible, was written partly because of the fact that in the diaspora there were many Jews who were better educated in Greek than they were in Hebrew or Aramaic, and the translation offered the ability for Greek-speaking Jews to be able to read their religious texts. So, but sorry, maybe I wasn't responding to the point that you made, but carry on.
I'm just wondering why a highly intellectual, literate, fluent Greek speaking Jew, what is their motivation to write the Gospels?
Well, I think that Matthew and Matthew and Luke represent authors who disagreed with the portrayal of Jesus and the disciples, disagreed with the portrayal found in Mark. And I think that they represented believers within a Christian community at the time.
So you think
And
that
they wanted to effectively make a different statement about what Christian belief was and how to deal with relevant problems that they were facing as Christians within a church in their day. I mean, like, you have to get into the specifics and what to become convinced of this point of view, but the particular type of evidence that people use to conclude this is they look at where changes occurred in the Matthean account from the Markan account. So they look at the differences between them, where Matthew's account diverges, and they ask the question, what is it that the author is trying to say, and what is it that the author believes that would make them make a change from the text that they're obviously relying on. And what you find is that there's consistencies in the types of changes that they make across the gospel. And those consistencies seem to represent like points of view that Woodley scholars hypothesize existed within their churches.
See, the changes that I think happened in Matthew, Luke, and John were, number one, to fix mistakes that Mark did, or when I say mistakes, I mean like just excluding some important things that they thought should have been said to historicize this Jesus person. And like, for example, Mark doesn't talk about the birth of Jesus at all, so they thought, oh, we need to add this if we want to make Jesus look like a real person. And then Luke read Matthew's account and Mark's account and said, oh, well, wait a minute, this doesn't fit with the prophecy, so I need to put in the census part to make this work. And so I can totally see non-Jews, Greeks, writing the Gospels and not believing a word of it. And writing a story, a screenplay, and based on the Old Testament and based on Greek literature, but realizing, oh, in order to make the continuity perfect, they had to fix these problems.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really think so. I think that like Matthew and Luke more represent like regional differences that existed within Christianity, and then those gospels became the primary gospel that was relied on within those communities. And maybe you're just more cynical than I am, but I think that, I mean, I think Matthew and Luke, maybe they knew the inside knowledge, like, and kind of, didn't, knew that they were writing, that they were like forging details that weren't true. But I at least think that they did it to make a point which was consistent with something that they believed. I think that the changes that they were making were because of the fact that they existed within communities that held those beliefs. And I think that those beliefs probably just came about naturally, like through the course of evolution, religious evolution, like in the same way that you have particular churches in Christianity nowadays that believe different things to one another. I think that, yeah. It's probably worth getting into into specifics about what was changed and why it would plausibly be changed. And maybe you're right. Like maybe the most plausible explanation is that they didn't believe any of it, that they were doing it because making these modifications were somehow crucial in pacifying Jews. And converting more Jews to Christianity. But I don't really think that that's why. I think that the details that they modified were less crucial to making Jews come to believe in Christianity and more crucial to make a consistent portrayal of Jesus, a portrayal of Jesus consistent with what their community believed.
I never knew that you disagreed with me on the passion play theory.
Well, no, I agree with it when it comes to Mark. I think that Mark, definitely knows that he's writing historical fiction, but I think that he's telling a story that has very strong moral points that are consistent with what he believes about Jesus. I think he's historicizing Jesus in a way to make Jesus's message more vivid and compelling to people. I think that he actually believes in the celestial Jesus, that he believes that Jesus is the road to salvation, and that Jesus is the one who died and resurrected for our sins and to redeem us. But I just think he's doing it in a way that that might sound like a crazy view, but there's evidence that this happened to other figures in history as well, that they were historicized in this manner. And it's also we have evidence that in Greek literary education, that one of the things that people would do as part of their education is to write historical stories, effectively like historical fiction, to tell a particular to sell a particular point of view, to convey a more general truth that was more important than the allegory and the historicization that they were using to convey it. And I think that Mark's gospel definitely represents somebody. The author is selling it because the author.
So do you believe Mark believed he was writing about a real person?
I don't think that Mark believed he was writing about events that happened in history in the way that he writes it. But I believe that he, in the points that he's making, he believes in the truth of them. For example, when he paints Jesus as the replacement for the need of the Jewish cult, and the new, effectively like the new connection between God's people and God, I think that that's because he believed that about Jesus. And I think that he uses historical fiction, like, for example, the withering of the fig tree surrounding the cleansing of the temple, as a means to convey the point that the temple cult is no longer necessary because God has sent his, a new divine, way of communicating with him and receiving salvation.
What was the name of the younger Flavian? There was two generals, Flavians. Was it Herod and...
I don't know exactly. I couldn't tell you that.
I seem to remember reading something about the son, the younger Flavian, married some very prominent Jewish woman. And so now we have a Roman ruler, a general, who has access to the wealth of information from the Old Testament through his wife. And
yeah, that rings a bell. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Which would go more in line with my hypothesis that...
Is that the theory that's argued by Joseph Atwell?
I'm not sure. I just remember this in my head from...
I think it is. And, well, I mean, I haven't actually read Atwell's books, but I have at least, listened to others that I respect to have a lot of suspicion about his interpretation of the origins of early Christianity. A lot of skepticism, at least. Like Richard Carrier, for example, has written quite well enough about Atwell.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, the reality is that whether or not we have a way to know exactly how Christianity came about, we don't get to just... it's not as if not knowing for sure means that we just assume that the Bible is true, or that he did exist. Okay,
we should be coming back. Yeah, we're back. Sorry about that, guys.
So the point that I was trying to make is one thing that people they find it really hard to understand when it comes to history, or at least hard to admit is true, is that there's nothing about the world and nothing about the universe that demands or makes it true that we would have all the evidence that we need to know what happened in the past. So history is actually a very probabilistic field where it can be quite difficult to make certain conclusions about what happened. And often the position that we're left in is just simply a position of not knowing, of agnosticism, of having plausible theories about what might be true, but not yet having evidence that distinguishes between them. So it might well be true that Jesus came about as, what you could call a conspiracy among Roman elites to produce a religion that pacified the Jews, or it could not be true, and we simply don't have the evidence. Maybe we don't have the evidence to distinguish that, or it might be the case that it came about through, a belief in a divine being, and it would be worthwhile finding out why he is so confident that theory is not very probable or plausible. But yeah, to emphasize again, when it comes to history, it's a probabilistic field. We don't always have the evidence that we wish that we had, and we can't always know for sure what is true.
YouTube Live is dying on us.
I'm almost ready to
finish
anyway, but that's why I'm agnostic about Jesus' his Bible portrays, but I can imagine there not being as well, and both seem pretty plausible to me. It might well be true that Bible portrays, but I can imagine there not being as well, and both seem pretty.
Okay.
See you, dude.
Yeah, hang on a second. Seems like it's working now. So I just want to thank everyone who listened. Sorry about the end, guys. We've got some technical difficulties. But have a good night. Merry Christmas, Eve, and all that jazz. And we'll see you next time.
Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.